Evelyn Carrington had always been a woman with a plan. From a young age, she had understood the value of independence and hard work, of pulling herself up by her bootstraps and pushing forward no matter the obstacles. Raised in a modest, working-class family, she had watched her parents struggle to make ends meet, always working overtime just to keep their heads above water. Evelyn had vowed early on that she would never find herself in that position. She wanted a life of security, of wealth, of power. She dreamed of a future that wasn't defined by financial uncertainty, but one where she could walk into any room and command the respect she knew she deserved. Her career was her everything. She had climbed the corporate ladder in record time, quickly earning a reputation as a shrewd and competent strategist. Her ability to spot opportunities in the most unlikely of places had made her a force to be reckoned with. But despite her professional success, there was something that gnawed at her. The world she inhabited, the world of high society, wealth, and corporate politics, was a world built on relationships, and Evelyn had never quite figured out how to navigate them. She had always thought of herself as an outsider, watching as others wove intricate webs of influence and connections, knowing that these ties were often more valuable than any business deal. Evelyn didn't have the luxury of relying on family connections or friendships to advance her career. She had built her success from the ground up, and she intended to keep it that way. But deep down, Evelyn knew there was a ceiling, one that she couldn't break through alone. There was always a point at which ambition alone wasn't enough. It was during one of those long, restless nights spent in the corner office of her downtown firm that she first heard about Red Ashford. At first, she hadn't thought much of him. Ashford Enterprises, a tech company valued at billions, had always been a giant in the industry, with Rhett at its helm. The name was synonymous with success, power, and unrelenting ambition. Rhett Ashford, once the brilliant young CEO of the company, had been a fixture in the media, celebrated for his meteoric rise and his charming personality. He was the kind of man that women fawned over and that men respected, a true titan in the business world. But then came the accident. It happened suddenly, an overnight tragedy that sent shockwaves through the business world. A car crash had left Rhett Ashford paralyzed from the waist down, and just like that, the invincible CEO became the subject of a different kind of story. Gone was the charismatic, ever-present leader who commanded attention in every room he entered. Now, Rhett Ashford was a man facing an uncertain future, a man whose empire was crumbling without him at the helm. The rumors began almost immediately. Some said his company would soon be sold off to the highest bidder, others said that Rhett had lost all interest in running the business. And yet, amidst all the speculation, Evelyn found herself wondering, what if she could be the one to step in? What if she could find a way to secure not only the future of Ashford Enterprises but also her own future, one far more secure than anything she could achieve on her own? She had read every article, every interview about Rhett's tragic accident and the subsequent struggle to keep his company afloat. The more she read, the more she realized that this might be her opportunity. Evelyn wasn't interested in the sympathy that others were offering him. What she saw in Rhett was an opportunity for something far greater than pity. She had always been a woman who understood the value of leverage, and Rhett Ashford's vulnerability presented a rare chance. The idea was simple, almost too simple: marry him. It wasn't a romantic notion, but it was one based on strategy. Marrying Rhett Ashford would grant her a position of power in the business world, one that she could never achieve on her own. It would also give her access to his immense wealth, his connections, and most importantly, his company. With his health still uncertain, he needed someone by his side, someone to take over the day-to-day operations and ensure that Ashford Enterprises stayed afloat. But this wasn't about love. Not for Evelyn. She had no illusions about that. She wasn't looking for romance, nor was she looking for a knight in shining armor. She was looking for stability, both financial and professional. And Rhett Ashford, despite his tragic accident, still had everything she needed to secure her future. Evelyn's plan was simple: marry Rhett, help him regain control of his company, and in return, gain a life of luxury and financial freedom. She didn't know what kind of relationship they would have, but she was certain it wouldn't matter. They would be partners in every sense of the word, linked by a shared desire for success and stability. Love was an afterthought. Her mind was made up. But before she could take any action, she needed to meet him. She had to see him face to face, understand who he was now, and assess whether he would be amenable to the kind of arrangement she had in mind. She made the call the next day. It wasn't difficult to get an audience with Rhett. His condition had made him more reclusive, but his team was eager to keep the company's affairs moving forward, and they saw the benefit of having someone like Evelyn involved. After all, she was known for her strategic brilliance and had an impressive track record in business. When she finally met Rhett in person, she was struck by how different he was from the man she had imagined. He was still handsome, but there was an air of weariness about him now, a kind of sadness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. His injury had taken more than just his mobility, it had taken something from him, something that made him seem distant, even a little defeated. But despite that, there was still a fire in him, a fire that Evelyn could recognize. It wasn't gone. It was buried under the surface, but it was still there. He wasn't ready to give up, not yet. And that, she realized, was what made him so appealing. He still had the potential to be the leader of Ashford Enterprises, and with her help, he could take it to heights he hadn't yet imagined. Their meeting was brief, cordial, but nothing about it suggested that love would be a part of the equation. They both understood the stakes. Evelyn wasn't there to get to know him as a person, to form some kind of emotional connection. She was there to make a deal. She offered him exactly what he needed, a partner who could help manage the company while he focused on his health, someone who could give him the space he needed to heal without the pressure of running a multi-billion-dollar corporation. In exchange, she would get everything she had worked for. Access to the Ashford legacy. A seat at the table of power. Security. You need someone, Evelyn said, her voice steady, unwavering. And I need security. I think we can help each other. Rhett studied her for a long time before replying, his gaze intense but calculating. You're asking me to marry you, he said, his voice low, almost amused. Evelyn nodded. Not for love. But for mutual benefit. They both understood the terms, and in that moment, neither of them was interested in pretending otherwise. They could both see the advantages of such a union. And so, the deal was made. Evelyn had secured her future. She would marry Rhett Ashford, not because of love, but because of strategy. And in doing so, she would rise to a power she could never have achieved on her own. As she left the meeting, she felt a strange sense of certainty. This wasn't just a business deal, it was the beginning of something much larger, something that neither of them could yet understand. But one thing was clear, Evelyn had always gotten what she wanted. And now, she would get it again. The morning after their conversation, Evelyn sat at her desk, staring at the contract in front of her. The ink was dry, the decision made. She was married. It wasn't the wedding she had dreamed of, but then again, she hadn't been expecting a fairy tale. This marriage wasn't about love, not for her. It was a business arrangement, pure and simple. And yet, as she sat there, the weight of it began to settle over her. She had married a man who had become a shell of the person he once was, a man who was now dependent on others in ways he never had been before. Rhett Ashford, the once invincible CEO of Ashford Enterprises, was now a man confined to a wheelchair, unable to do the things he once took for granted. His paralysis was not just physical, it had seeped into his confidence, his sense of self-worth, his entire life. Evelyn couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to spend every day with him, living in this strange, half-life where neither of them knew what to expect. She wasn't naive enough to believe that this was going to be an easy road, but she also couldn't deny the strange pull that existed between them. She had thought it would be a straightforward arrangement, she would step in as his partner, run the business, and keep everything running smoothly. But there was something else, something unspoken, that she couldn't ignore. She had expected to feel more relieved, but instead, she felt uncertain. She had come to him with a plan. She had wanted a life of security, and she had gotten it. But now that the deal was made, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than she had anticipated. She had thought she would be the one in control, the one who would steer the ship and take what she wanted. But now, as she sat in the quiet of his office, with nothing but the sound of her breathing and the distant hum of the city outside, she wondered if she had underestimated what Red Ashford could still offer her, and, perhaps, what he would end up offering her in ways she didn't expect. She was jolted from her thoughts by the sound of the door opening. Red wheeled himself into the room, his presence as commanding as it had ever been, even though he was no longer the man he had once been. His eyes were sharp, but there was something else there too, something more vulnerable than she had seen before. The man who had once been the epitome of power and strength was now physically reliant on others, and though he was doing his best to hide it, she could see the cracks. "You're here early," he said, his voice steady but not as confident as it had once been. "I've always been an early riser," Evelyn replied, standing up from her desk and smoothing out the wrinkles in her suit. She had dressed for the part, as she always did. Today, however, she felt a bit more self-conscious than usual, as though something had shifted in her, even if she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Rhett's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, and for the briefest second, she felt exposed. But then, as always, he composed himself, the sharp edge returning to his demeanor. "I've gone over the quarterly projections," he began, moving his wheelchair closer to the desk. "I need to make sure you're on track. The company can't afford to lose momentum now." Evelyn nodded, her mind already shifting gears. Business. Of course, that was what mattered most. She was here to help him rebuild his empire. "I've already spoken with the board. We're in good shape, but we need to focus on a few key partnerships. Ashford Enterprises has lost some ground, but with your name behind us, we can regain our footing." She could see a flicker of something in his eyes, a brief flash of the old Red Ashford, the man who had built this empire, the man who had led with such force and vision. It was there, in the way he looked at her, as though he could still see the possibility of success, the chance to reclaim what he had lost. For a moment, she didn't feel like a stranger in this house, in this business. She felt like his partner, as though they were in this together. "I trust you," Rhett said, his voice low but steady. It was as though he was trying to convince himself more than her. "I don't want to fail again." His words struck her harder than she expected. There was a vulnerability in them that she hadn't anticipated. Rhett had been a man who was used to leading, to calling the shots. To hear him speak so frankly about his fears, to see the uncertainty in his eyes, was something she hadn't prepared for. "You won't fail," Evelyn said, her voice more reassuring than she had meant it to be. "You've built this company from nothing, Rhett. This is just another challenge. We'll face it together." He looked at her for a long moment, and this time, she didn't look away. There was something in his gaze, something more than business. She wasn't sure if it was hope, desperation, or something else entirely, but she couldn't deny the way it made her feel. "We will," he said quietly, almost as if he was speaking to himself. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words. Evelyn felt her heart beat a little faster, her chest tightening, but she couldn't let herself get distracted. She was here to do a job. She had to stay focused. "There's one more thing," Rhett said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. "I know we've discussed the professional side of our arrangement, but I want to make sure you're comfortable here. This isn't just a business deal. We're living in the same house, working together every day. I want you to feel at ease. And if you have any concerns, I need you to tell me." Evelyn had expected the conversation to be purely business. She had expected him to focus on the company and nothing more. But now, he was talking about feelings, his and hers, and she wasn't sure how to respond. She wasn't used to opening up, to allowing anyone to see the cracks in her carefully constructed facade. "I'm fine," she said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "This is what we both agreed to. There's no need for anything more than that." But as she said it, she could feel the lie sitting heavily in her chest. She didn't want to admit it, but she had begun to feel something more than just business. She was living with this man, sharing space with him, and as their time together stretched on, she realized that the distance she had carefully placed between them was beginning to close. Rhett didn't push her. He just nodded, as if accepting her answer. But there was something in the way he looked at her, something that made Evelyn question whether he, too, felt the weight of this unspoken connection. "I'll let you get back to work," he said, his voice back to its usual businesslike tone. "I just wanted to make sure we're clear." Evelyn nodded, taking a breath to steady herself. "We're clear," she replied, her voice firm. As he left the room, she sat back down at her desk, staring at the papers in front of her. Her mind was still racing, but now, something was different. She wasn't just a business partner to Rhett anymore. She was becoming something more, a presence in his life, someone he trusted. It was a dangerous shift, one she wasn't ready for, but it was there nonetheless. Evelyn hadn't planned on falling for him. She had never allowed herself to get close to anyone, least of all someone like Rhett. But there was something about him, something in the way he had looked at her, in the way he trusted her, that began to break down the walls she had spent so long building. She couldn't afford to lose focus, to lose herself in whatever this was becoming. But as the day wore on, and as she continued her work, she realized that it was getting harder and harder to ignore the feelings that were slowly, but surely, taking root. She wasn't sure where this was going, but one thing was certain: her life had changed the moment she married Rhett Ashford. And she wasn't sure she could ever go back to the way things had been. The days after their wedding passed in a blur for Evelyn. She had expected the adjustment to be difficult, but she hadn't anticipated the weight of it all. The responsibilities of managing Ashford Enterprises, keeping the board members satisfied, and running a household that had once been ruled by a powerful, independent man now fell squarely on her shoulders. Rhett had become increasingly reclusive, allowing her to take the lead in their marriage as well as the business. He still attended board meetings and contributed in small ways, but it was clear that the accident had changed him in more ways than one. The confident, invincible CEO she had seen in the news now sat in a wheelchair, his posture slumped and his body dependent on machines and others to function. But it wasn't just his physical transformation that had changed things. His confidence, his sharp edge, had been dulled. The man she had once read about in business articles, the one who commanded attention and respect with a single glance, was now a man unsure of his place in the world. And Evelyn, for all her ambition, was unsure of hers as well. As the weeks passed, their interactions became more and more routine. Evelyn would spend her days at the office, managing Ashford Enterprises with the same precision she had always applied to her work. Rhett would join her in the evening for dinner, and the two would discuss the state of the company, the financial projections, the long-term plans. It was all business, just like she had wanted it to be. But then there were moments when she would catch him looking at her, those quiet, fleeting moments when their gazes would lock across the dinner table or during their meetings. In those moments, she felt the pull again, the tension between them that had been there since the beginning, the sense that what they were doing wasn't just a contract. Rhett had been kind to her, respectful even, and he had never pushed her to talk about their personal lives. He understood that their marriage was a business arrangement, and he seemed content to let it remain that way. Yet, there was something in the way he looked at her, something in the way he trusted her with the future of his company, that made her heart ache. She had never intended to develop any kind of affection for him, but as the days wore on, she found herself drawn to him in ways she hadn't anticipated. On the surface, their relationship was one of mutual respect. Evelyn was running Ashford Enterprises with a skill that even the most seasoned executives admired. She had proven herself capable, and the company was beginning to rebound under her leadership. But as successful as she was professionally, the emotional connection that had started to build between her and Rhett began to weigh on her. She had promised herself that this marriage would never be about emotions. She had made a deal, and she intended to honor it. But with every passing day, she found herself wondering if she was starting to care for him in a way that went beyond the business partnership they had set up. One evening, after a long day at the office, Evelyn returned home to find Rhett sitting by the large fireplace in the living room, his wheelchair angled toward the flames. The soft glow of the fire illuminated his face, and for the first time in a long time, Evelyn saw something in his expression that made her stop in her tracks. It wasn't just the usual frustration or detachment she had grown accustomed to seeing in him, it was something softer, something that spoke of loneliness. He looked up when he heard her enter, a faint smile appearing on his lips. "You're late," he said, though his tone was lighter than usual. "Long day?" Evelyn smiled politely, dropping her briefcase on the nearby table and walking over to him. "Yes, but you know how it is. A few more deals closed, a few more decisions made. How about you? How was your day?" Rhett shrugged, his hands resting on the wheels of his chair. "Same as always. Been reading through some old files. Trying to keep myself busy." There was a heaviness in his voice, a quiet sadness that Evelyn couldn't ignore. She had seen the way he had retreated into himself, the way he had distanced himself from the world after the accident. She had respected his space, knowing that he wasn't ready to confront the full extent of what had happened to him, but tonight, she couldn't help but feel the weight of his isolation. "You don't have to do it alone, you know," Evelyn said, her voice quieter now, softer than usual. "You've got me. You've always had me." Rhett looked at her then, his blue eyes piercing in a way that made her heart flutter. "I didn't ask for any of this, Evelyn. I didn't ask for you to marry me, to step in and take control of everything. You didn't need to do this." Evelyn felt a tightness in her chest at his words. She knew that this wasn't the life he had envisioned for himself. He had once been a man who controlled everything around him, a man who had the world at his fingertips. And now, here he was, unable to walk, unable to control his own body, and unsure of his future. "I did it because I wanted to, Rhett," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "I wanted to help you. I wanted to build something with you. I don't expect anything from you, except that we work together to get through this. We don't have to be in love, Rhett. But we can be partners. And I think we're doing a damn good job of it." Rhett looked at her for a long moment, his gaze searching, almost as if he were trying to read her. And then, as if he had made up his mind about something, he leaned back in his chair, his shoulders relaxing for the first time that evening. "I don't know if I can ever get back to where I was, Evelyn," he said quietly, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "I don't know if I'll ever feel like myself again. But I don't want to lose everything I've worked for. I don't want to lose the company. And I don't want to lose the chance to be someone again." His words hit Evelyn harder than she expected. She had known that Rhett was struggling with his physical limitations, but she hadn't fully understood how deeply it was affecting him. She hadn't realized that, despite everything he had accomplished, he still felt like a failure. It broke something inside her to see him like this, to hear the pain in his voice. "You won't lose everything, Rhett," she said softly, kneeling down beside him, her hand resting gently on his. "You're not alone in this." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them was heavy with unspoken emotions, and Evelyn couldn't deny the way her heart ached for him. She had promised herself that this marriage wouldn't be about love, but in that moment, as she looked into his eyes, she couldn't deny that she cared about him. She hadn't planned for this to happen, hadn't expected to feel anything for him beyond the confines of their business arrangement. But somehow, it had happened anyway. "Maybe we're both trying to find something we've lost," Rhett said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe that's what this is, finding a way to move forward. Together." Evelyn nodded, her hand still resting on his. She didn't have an answer to give him, not yet. She didn't know where this was all headed, but for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe they could find their way together. Not as lovers, not yet, but as something deeper, something more meaningful. They had both been lost in different ways, but maybe, just maybe, they could help each other find their way back. That night, as Evelyn lay in bed, the weight of everything they had discussed lingered in her mind. The lines between business and personal had begun to blur, and the distance she had kept between herself and Rhett seemed to be closing faster than she had expected. She wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do, but she knew one thing for sure: things had changed. And she didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she was willing to find out. She had married him for security, for the company, for the future. But in that moment, she realized she might have married him for more. She just didn't know how to admit it yet. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of meetings, deals, and long nights that seemed to blend together. Evelyn had fully embraced her role at Ashford Enterprises, and it was clear to everyone involved that she was making significant strides in turning the company around. Her efficiency, intelligence, and ability to work under pressure were unmatched, and her reputation grew stronger with each passing day. But despite her professional success, there was an undercurrent of uncertainty she couldn't shake, a feeling that had settled deep in her chest ever since that night with Rhett. She couldn't deny that the dynamic between them had changed. There was still no love between them, at least not in the traditional sense, but there was something deeper, something unspoken, that connected them. It wasn't just the business partnership anymore. It was something about the way they worked together, the way they communicated without words, the way their goals had become intertwined. She found herself thinking about him more often than she cared to admit, wondering if perhaps he was thinking about her too. Rhett, for his part, seemed to be regaining a bit of his old self. The treatments, though slow, were showing progress, and he was becoming more mobile with the help of his prosthetics. It wasn't full recovery, but it was enough to give him hope again. And though he remained deeply involved in the business, he was beginning to let go in ways he hadn't before. He trusted Evelyn, not just with the company, but with the things that had once been his alone to manage. She had become his right hand, someone he could rely on, someone who understood the weight of everything he was going through. But the more they worked together, the more Evelyn found herself questioning her feelings. She had gone into this marriage with one goal in mind, to secure her future, but now, with every passing day, that goal seemed less important. There was a connection between them that she hadn't expected, and it was beginning to make her uncomfortable. She hadn't planned for this. She hadn't planned for him. It was one Friday evening when everything seemed to come to a head. Evelyn had spent the day in meetings with the board of directors, trying to secure a deal that would help Ashford Enterprises break into international markets. The pressure had been building, and by the time she arrived back at the estate, she was exhausted, physically, mentally, and emotionally. The large mansion was quiet, the soft hum of the air conditioning the only sound breaking the stillness. As she walked into the living room, she was surprised to find Rhett sitting by the fireplace. His wheelchair was positioned close to the flames, and he seemed deep in thought, his gaze distant. For a moment, Evelyn hesitated in the doorway, watching him. He looked different, vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. His usual air of authority was gone, replaced by something quieter, more introspective. She cleared her throat softly, and he looked up, a faint but genuine smile tugging at his lips. "Evelyn," he said, his voice calm, yet there was a hint of something else, something almost uncertain. "You're home late." "I had to finish up some things," she replied, walking over to him. She paused for a moment, glancing at the empty seat beside him. She didn't sit, not yet, but she felt a strange pull to be closer. "I didn't expect to see you here. I thought you'd be resting." Rhett shrugged slightly, his hands resting in his lap. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "About everything." Evelyn took a deep breath. She could feel the shift in the air between them, the weight of his words hanging in the silence. She didn't know where this conversation was going, but she couldn't turn back now. "I've been thinking about it too," she admitted, stepping closer, her eyes never leaving his. "About the company, about us." His expression softened, the usual tension in his shoulders easing. "And what have you been thinking?" Evelyn hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to put her thoughts into words. She had kept her emotions locked up, kept everything professional, but now, as she stood in front of him, she couldn't deny the vulnerability she was feeling. She had come into this marriage with a plan, but somewhere along the way, that plan had started to crumble. "I've been thinking about how different things are now," she said quietly. "I came here to help you, to run the company, to get everything back on track. But I don't know. I didn't expect this kind of connection. I didn't expect you." Rhett's eyes darkened, but there was no anger there, only understanding. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. "You've always been the one who's been in control," he said softly. "And I've always been the one in charge. But now, we're both learning how to navigate this. I never thought I'd be here, Evelyn. I never thought I'd need someone the way I need you. And I know that this arrangement was never meant to be personal. But I can't help but feel like maybe, just maybe, there's more to it than that." Evelyn felt her breath catch in her throat. His words echoed in her mind, each one sinking deeper into her chest. This wasn't just about business anymore. It couldn't be. She could see it in his eyes, the uncertainty, the hope, the vulnerability. She had never seen him like this before, and it terrified her. She didn't know how to respond. She hadn't planned for this, didn't know how to navigate these feelings. "I don't know what to do with that, Rhett," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I came into this marriage because I wanted security. I wanted to protect myself. And you needed help. We both agreed on that. But now," she paused, her heart racing. "I don't know if I'm still doing this for the same reasons anymore." Rhett took a deep breath, his gaze softening even further. "You don't have to have all the answers right now, Evelyn. You never have to have all the answers. But I need you to know that whatever happens between us, whatever this is, you don't have to be afraid of it." Evelyn swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't used to letting herself feel anything for anyone, let alone someone like Rhett. She had always kept her emotions in check, focused on the goal ahead. But now, as she looked at him, she realized that the walls she had built around herself were starting to crumble. "I never expected this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never expected to care about you." Rhett's expression shifted, and for the first time since the accident, he looked truly vulnerable. He wasn't the powerful, unshakable CEO anymore. He was just a man, struggling with his own demons, his own uncertainty. And in that moment, Evelyn realized that maybe, just maybe, they were both struggling in the same way. "I never expected to need anyone the way I need you," he replied, his voice quiet, raw. "But I do, Evelyn. I need you more than I ever thought I could." The words hung between them, heavy with emotion. Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat, her heart aching as she looked at him. She hadn't planned for this. She hadn't expected to find someone she could rely on, someone who could rely on her. But here they were, two people, broken in different ways, trying to navigate a future neither of them had expected. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came with understanding, with the weight of unspoken feelings. And in that silence, Evelyn realized something she hadn't allowed herself to believe before. She was no longer just in this for herself. She was in this for him, too. Maybe they had started out as business partners, as a means to an end, but somewhere along the way, they had become something more. They had become a team. And for the first time in a long time, Evelyn was willing to admit that this marriage, this arrangement, might have been more than just a transaction. It might have been the beginning of something real. "Maybe we're both still learning," Evelyn said softly, finally breaking the silence. "Maybe we don't have to have it all figured out." Rhett smiled faintly, his eyes still full of that quiet understanding. "Maybe not. But we'll figure it out. Together." And in that moment, Evelyn knew that they would. No matter what the future held, they would face it together. The weeks that followed the conversation between Evelyn and Rhett felt like a strange mixture of routine and change. Every day, Evelyn continued to manage Ashford Enterprises with increasing skill, earning the respect of the employees and board members alike. The company's stock had begun to rise again, showing steady signs of recovery, largely due to her diligence and foresight. Rhett, for his part, was slowly but surely regaining some mobility, though he still depended on the prosthetics to walk. Despite his physical progress, it was clear that the emotional scars from his accident would take much longer to heal. At night, they would sit together in the large dining room, discussing business, occasionally exchanging pleasantries, and then retreating to their separate quarters. There was a palpable distance between them, an emotional gap that neither of them dared to bridge. But in the quiet of those evenings, something had changed. The connection they shared had deepened in subtle ways. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a bond that neither of them could ignore. There was a vulnerability in the air that both of them struggled to come to terms with, yet neither could deny it. Rhett had started relying on Evelyn more and more, not just for the day-to-day operations of the company but also for the emotional support he had been deprived of since his accident. In some ways, Evelyn had become his anchor, the one constant in his life. And though she had married him for security, she found herself drawn to him in ways that she hadn't anticipated. She had never imagined that something as simple as sitting beside him at dinner could make her feel the way she did. His presence, once so imposing, now felt comforting. The pain in his eyes, the fragility he had tried so hard to mask, made her feel protective of him. Despite everything, Evelyn had started to wonder if this marriage could be more than just a business deal. She had never been someone who had believed in love at first sight or any of the fairy tale notions she had dismissed as naive. But now, with each passing day, she realized that she was beginning to care for him. It was subtle at first, a fleeting glance, a soft word of encouragement, but over time, it had grown into something she couldn't easily explain. She wasn't sure if it was a simple emotional attachment or something deeper, but she knew that her feelings for Rhett had begun to change. One evening, as they sat in the sitting room after dinner, Evelyn looked over at him, watching as he absent-mindedly ran his fingers along the armrest of his wheelchair. The fire crackled softly in the background, its warmth a sharp contrast to the coolness in the room between them. They hadn't spoken much that evening, as the conversation had been largely about the progress of the company. Evelyn had been preoccupied with the upcoming merger, while Rhett had seemed distant, his mind preoccupied with something else. She couldn't remember the last time they had spoken about anything that wasn't business. Rhett, Evelyn said softly, breaking the silence between them. She hadn't meant to interrupt his thoughts, but the words came out before she could stop them. How are you really doing? He looked at her, surprised by the question. His brow furrowed for a moment, as though he hadn't expected her to ask, but then he seemed to relax slightly, a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. Some days are better than others, he said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of frustration and resignation. Some days I feel like I can almost get back to normal, but then, it hits me again. I'm still not who I used to be. Evelyn's heart twisted at his words, and for the first time in a long while, she realized how much pain he was carrying. She had always seen him as the unshakable CEO, the man who built his empire with ruthless precision. But now, sitting before him, she saw a different side, one that was far more human than she had ever anticipated. She reached out, her hand resting gently on his. You don't have to be the same person you were, she said softly. You've already accomplished so much, and the people who care about you, those who matter, see you for who you are, not just for what you were. He met her gaze, his eyes searching hers as though he were trying to understand her words. For a moment, Evelyn thought he might pull away, but instead, he stayed, his hand still resting in hers. I'm not sure I know who I am anymore, he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. Before the accident, I was so sure of myself. I had everything figured out. But now, it's all different. And I don't know how to navigate this new version of myself. Evelyn squeezed his hand gently, her heart aching for him. She had never thought about the emotional toll of Rhett's accident. She had been so focused on her own ambitions, her own goals, that she hadn't truly considered the internal struggle he was facing. It was one thing to lose your physical abilities, but to lose your sense of self, your identity, was something far more complicated. You don't have to navigate it alone, she said, her voice steady but filled with empathy. You have me. And together, we can figure it out. Rhett didn't speak at first, but his gaze softened, and she could see something in his eyes, a flicker of gratitude, perhaps, or something more. They had never spoken like this before, never allowed themselves to truly open up to one another. But in this moment, Evelyn felt something shift between them, a bond that had grown out of mutual respect, shared vulnerability, and unspoken trust. For the first time since their marriage began, Evelyn allowed herself to relax. She had spent so much of the past few months guarding herself, keeping her emotions at bay, trying to stay focused on the bigger picture. But tonight, she felt a sense of connection with Rhett that was both unfamiliar and comforting. She had never imagined that their marriage, this strategic, calculated arrangement, could evolve into something more meaningful. And yet, in this moment, it seemed as though they were both finding their way towards something neither of them had anticipated. I never thought I'd end up in a situation like this, Rhett said, his voice quieter now, his fingers still tracing the edge of the armrest. But I'm starting to realize that maybe this is the life I'm meant to have. Maybe I don't need to go back to who I was. Maybe I just need to figure out who I can be now. Evelyn smiled, her heart swelling at his words. I think that's exactly it, she said softly. It's not about going back. It's about moving forward. And we'll do that, together. The room fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that only came from two people who truly understood each other. Evelyn knew that they still had a long road ahead of them, but for the first time, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. They were in this together. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side. Later that evening, as Evelyn prepared to go to bed, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. She was still the woman who had come into this marriage with a plan, a woman who had been focused on securing her future. But now, she wasn't so sure what the future held. Rhett had changed her in ways she hadn't expected. He had become more than just a business partner. He had become a person she cared about deeply, in a way she hadn't planned. As she climbed into bed that night, she found herself thinking about their conversation, about the bond they had shared in that quiet moment. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something. And for the first time in a long time, Evelyn wondered if maybe, just maybe, this marriage could turn into something more than either of them had expected. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Evelyn felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe they had both been lost, but together, they might just find a way forward. The days seemed to pass by faster than Evelyn could keep track of, each one blending into the next with work, meetings, and endless decisions. Ashford Enterprises was growing stronger with every passing week, the stock price climbing steadily, the board members gradually regaining faith in her leadership. Evelyn's days were packed with strategies, projections, and phone calls, and yet, no matter how successful she was at work, there was always a nagging thought that hovered in the back of her mind. Rhett. The more Evelyn tried to focus on the business, the more she found herself thinking about him. In a way, the separation between their professional relationship and their marriage had become more and more difficult to maintain. She had come into this marriage with a clear goal, to secure herself financially and to help Rhett regain control of the company. But somewhere along the way, something changed. She wasn't sure if it was him, or if it was just her, but she found herself growing closer to him in ways she didn't fully understand. Rhett was still struggling, though it was clear that he had come a long way since the early days after his accident. His mobility had improved, and though he could walk again, it was with the assistance of a prosthetic. The sight of him, once so confident and commanding, now so physically vulnerable, was a constant reminder of how quickly things could change. Yet, despite the challenges he faced, there was a quiet strength in him, one that never quite disappeared. But lately, that strength seemed to be slowly giving way to something else, something more fragile, more uncertain. He no longer hid it, and the vulnerability that had been present in their conversations the previous weeks began to show itself more often. There were moments when Evelyn would find him staring out of the window, a distant look in his eyes as if he were searching for something he couldn't quite grasp. In those moments, she would hesitate before approaching him, unsure of how to offer comfort without overstepping the boundaries they had both set. They had always maintained a professional distance, an understanding that their marriage was a contract, not a romance, but as the days wore on, the lines between business and something more personal were beginning to blur. One evening, after another long day of meetings, Evelyn found herself walking through the grand hallway of the estate. The evening sun cast a soft golden light through the windows, and she could hear the faint sound of classical music playing softly in the background. She stopped at the study and glanced inside. Rhett was there, his wheelchair positioned in front of the desk, his eyes fixed on a set of financial reports in front of him. His posture was rigid, the air of authority that had once been so effortlessly his still lingering, but it was mixed with a sense of quiet exhaustion. "Rhett," she called softly, pushing the door open slightly. "You're still working?" He looked up, a brief, almost tired smile spreading across his face. "You're surprised?" "I've got a lot of catching up to do." Evelyn leaned against the doorframe, her eyes scanning the room. "You don't have to do everything yourself. You know I'm here." He hesitated for a moment, then slowly rolled his wheelchair away from the desk, his gaze shifting toward the window as if searching for something outside. "Sometimes, it's hard to let go, Evelyn. I'm used to being in control of everything, to making the decisions, to running things. But now it feels like I'm just watching from the sidelines." Evelyn's chest tightened at the rawness in his voice. She had always seen Rhett as the man who commanded power, who had a plan for everything. To hear him speak like this, to see him so vulnerable, unsettled something deep within her. She had never imagined that her relationship with him would evolve beyond business, but now, she was starting to see him not just as her partner in the company but as a man, one who was struggling, fighting to regain a sense of self. She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her, and walked over to him. "You don't have to do everything on your own, Rhett," she said quietly, sitting down across from him. "You've been carrying a lot. But you don't have to carry it alone anymore." Rhett's gaze flickered toward her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick, filled with words neither of them had said. Evelyn wasn't sure how to break the silence. She had always kept things professional, kept a wall between herself and everyone else, especially Rhett. But now, that wall was starting to feel more like a barrier. "You've been carrying this company, this life, on your own for so long," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I've been here, helping, but I think we both know I can't do this without you." "Not completely." Rhett let out a deep sigh, and for a moment, Evelyn thought he might retreat back into his old, guarded self. But then he spoke, his voice low and rough. "I don't know how to let go, Evelyn. I don't know how to trust anyone with this. I built Ashford Enterprises from nothing. I've always been the one who calls the shots. And now." He trailed off, his words unspoken but clear. Now, he was dependent on someone else. On her. Evelyn's heart swelled with a mixture of sympathy and something more, a tenderness she hadn't allowed herself to feel for him. She reached across the desk, her fingers brushing against his hand. It was a simple touch, but it held a weight to it, a shared understanding that neither of them could articulate. "You're not alone, Rhett," she said again, her voice steady now, as if she were convincing herself as much as him. "We're in this together. And together, we'll figure it out." Rhett didn't pull his hand away. Instead, he seemed to soften, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I don't deserve you, Evelyn. I never asked for you to do this for me." Evelyn shook her head, a small smile crossing her lips. "You don't have to deserve anything. You've done more than enough. I'm here because I want to be." For a brief moment, their gazes locked, and Evelyn saw something in his eyes that made her heart flutter, a flicker of hope, of trust. He was no longer the man who had everything under control. But in that moment, it didn't matter. They were learning how to work together, how to rebuild not just the company, but the lives they had both built in its shadow. Rhett looked at her for a long moment, the vulnerability in his eyes slowly giving way to a quiet strength. "Maybe I'm finally ready to accept help," he said, his voice a little firmer now. "Maybe I don't have to do everything alone." Evelyn nodded, her hand still resting on his. "We'll do it together. You don't have to carry it all on your own anymore." As they sat there in silence, the weight of the moment settled between them. There was still a long road ahead, physically, emotionally, and professionally, but for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt like they were on the same path. Not just business partners, not just a married couple by circumstance, but something more. Something real. The night stretched on, and for the first time, Evelyn didn't feel like she was just playing a role in a marriage that had started as a transaction. She wasn't just the woman helping Rhett manage his company, securing her future, keeping everything in motion. She was something else now, a partner, a confidant. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to care for the man she had married in ways she hadn't expected. By the time they finally parted for the evening, the quiet between them didn't feel like distance. It felt like connection. It felt like the beginning of something more, something neither of them had planned but both knew was now inevitable. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Evelyn allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just a marriage of convenience. It was something more. And she was beginning to realize that it was worth fighting for. The days following that quiet conversation in the study passed in a kind of suspended animation, where the weight of their shared understanding lingered but remained unspoken. Evelyn found herself focusing even more intently on Ashford Enterprises, pouring herself into the work, and it paid off. The company was steadily improving, new partnerships were being formed, and investor confidence was growing. But despite her professional success, there was an undeniable shift in her personal life. The more she saw Rhett, saw the man behind the CEO, the more she felt something change within herself. She had always prided herself on being in control of her emotions, but now, with Rhett, it was different. The connection between them was no longer just about business. It was about something more intimate, something neither of them had expected. Every day, Evelyn found herself noticing the smallest things, his laugh, the way his eyes would brighten when he spoke about something he was passionate about, the way he leaned in when they were deep in conversation. And yet, she couldn't ignore the painful truth that, for all his progress, Rhett was still struggling. His body might have regained some mobility, but his heart, his spirit, was still broken in places he wasn't ready to address. One evening, after a particularly taxing day spent negotiating with international investors, Evelyn returned to the estate later than usual. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt too heavy after a long day. She knew Rhett would be in the living room, as he often was when the day was over. There was something about the solitude of that room, the large, comfortable chairs, the fire crackling in the hearth, that seemed to give him peace, even though he no longer spent his time in the place of power he once inhabited. As she entered the living room, she found him just where she had expected, sitting by the fire. His wheelchair was positioned close enough that the warmth of the flames illuminated his face, but far enough away that he wouldn't be overheated. He was staring into the fire, his expression distant, lost in his thoughts. It was a sight that made her heart ache. He had always been a man of presence, someone whose energy filled the room, and now, it felt like he was often lost to the silence of his own mind. "Rhett?" Evelyn said softly, stepping into the room. He looked up, and for a moment, his eyes seemed to regain their focus, as if he had only just realized she was there. A soft, almost imperceptible smile crossed his lips. "You're late," he said with a playful edge to his voice, though his tone was still laced with weariness. "I'm sorry," she replied, walking over to him. "The negotiations took longer than expected. You know how it is." He nodded, and Evelyn could see the weight of his words hanging in the air. There was always that unspoken pressure for him, the constant awareness that he couldn't do everything he used to. He had come to rely on her more and more, not just in business, but in everything. He had started trusting her with things beyond what they had agreed upon in the beginning, his treatment plans, his daily routines, the small aspects of his life that he could no longer navigate alone. Evelyn stood beside him, her hand resting on the armrest of his chair. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice softer than she had intended. She wasn't just asking about his physical health. She was asking about him, about how he was really doing. Rhett let out a long sigh, his fingers tracing the edge of the chair. "I'm tired, Evelyn," he said quietly, his voice raw in a way she hadn't heard before. "Some days, it feels like I'm stuck in a life that doesn't belong to me. I used to run things. I used to be the one making all the decisions, controlling everything. And now..." He trailed off, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment, his hands resting on his lap. Evelyn's heart tightened as she watched him. She had never seen Rhett so defeated, so vulnerable. There was a part of her that felt helpless in the face of it, unsure of how to fix something so deeply ingrained in him, something beyond her reach. "You're not stuck, Rhett," Evelyn said, her voice filled with quiet determination. She moved to kneel beside him, her gaze steady and unwavering. "You've made it this far. You've come so far, and I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. We're not stuck." He looked up at her, his eyes searching hers, and for a moment, she could see a flicker of the man he used to be, the strong, determined man who had built an empire. But it was quickly replaced by the vulnerability that had become all too familiar in their interactions. He didn't say anything at first, but she could see the struggle behind his eyes. He wanted to say something, to respond, but the words wouldn't come. "You don't have to carry this alone," Evelyn added, her voice quieter now, more tender. "You've never been alone in this. Not really. Not with me." Rhett's lips parted, and for a moment, he almost looked like he wanted to argue, but the words never left his mouth. Instead, he looked down again, his expression softening as he allowed himself to take in her words. It was as if, for the first time in a long time, he was allowing himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to fight this battle by himself. "I don't know how to be who I was before," he said finally, his voice tinged with frustration. "I don't know if I can ever be that man again." Evelyn's heart ached for him. She could hear the defeat in his voice, the pain of someone who had lost not just his physical abilities but the very identity that had driven him. She couldn't pretend to know what that felt like, but she knew what it was like to feel lost in your own skin, to feel like you're not the person you used to be. And she understood the fear that came with that. "You don't have to be the man you were before," Evelyn said gently. "You're still you, Rhett. And I'm not asking you to be anyone else. I'm not asking you to be something you're not. I'm asking you to be here. With me. We'll figure this out. Together." There was a long silence between them, the weight of her words settling into the space. Evelyn wasn't sure what was happening between them, but she couldn't deny that something was shifting. She had married him for security, for business, for reasons that seemed so clear and defined in the beginning. But now, those reasons had started to blur, and she found herself caring for him in ways she hadn't anticipated. Rhett's gaze met hers again, this time softer, more vulnerable than it had ever been. His eyes held a mix of gratitude, pain, and something else, a quiet hope. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Evelyn," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've done more for me than I ever expected." She felt her heart flutter at his words, and for a brief moment, the air between them felt less heavy. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something. A connection. A bond that neither of them had planned, but that was growing stronger with every passing day. "You don't have to thank me," Evelyn said softly, her hand reaching out to gently rest on his. "I'm here because I want to be. And I'm not going anywhere." There was a shift between them, something that couldn't be fully understood but was still unmistakable. They were learning to lean on each other in ways neither of them had expected, building a foundation that was not just about business but about something deeper, something neither of them could fully define yet. The night stretched on, but the distance between them had closed. The tension had lifted, replaced by a quiet understanding. Evelyn knew they had a long road ahead, one filled with challenges and uncertainties, but for the first time, she felt like they could face it together. As she prepared to leave the room, her heart felt a little lighter. There were still so many unknowns between them, so many things left unsaid, but one thing was certain: whatever the future held, they were no longer just two people trapped in a marriage of convenience. They were partners, real, true partners, facing life's uncertainties together. And for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt ready to face whatever came next. The days seemed to stretch on, each one slipping quietly into the next. For Evelyn, time had begun to blur together. Ashford Enterprises was thriving, and the company's rebound was largely due to her unwavering commitment and hard work. The investors were happy, the board was satisfied, and everything seemed to be falling into place. But despite the success and the progress she had made in the professional sphere, there was still a feeling of discomfort that lingered in the back of her mind, a sense of something she hadn't yet fully dealt with. Rhett had continued his physical therapy and was making steady progress, but it was clear that there was more going on beneath the surface than anyone had realized. He had moments of clarity and determination, of that fierce resolve that had once made him such a successful CEO, but those moments were often followed by long stretches of quiet, where he would retreat into himself. Despite their growing connection, despite the many evenings they spent together in silence or discussing company matters, there was still a gap between them. Evelyn couldn't figure out what it was, but it felt like a weight that neither of them could lift. There were times when she would walk into a room and find him staring out the window, lost in thought, or sitting at his desk, his gaze unfocused. These small moments, so mundane, carried more weight than anything they'd said to each other in weeks. He wasn't just physically recovering. He was rebuilding himself from the ground up, trying to reconcile who he was now with who he had been before. It was a slow process, and Evelyn found herself wondering if she could even begin to understand it. She had married him for security, for stability, for an opportunity to build a life that was defined by something other than survival. She hadn't planned on becoming emotionally invested in him, hadn't planned on the connection that had begun to form between them. It had been business, simple and clear-cut, but somewhere along the way, the lines had blurred, and now Evelyn was not so sure where she stood. She couldn't help but think about what this all meant, what it meant for her future, what it meant for their marriage. Was it still a partnership of convenience, or was it something else? And if it was something else, how could she navigate it? One evening, after another long day, Evelyn found herself standing outside the study, her hand resting on the doorframe. She could hear the low murmur of conversation coming from inside, Rhett's voice and a few others, employees, perhaps, or members of his medical team. The door was slightly ajar, and she hesitated before pushing it open, stepping into the quiet of the room. Rhett was sitting by the window, as he often did, but this time, there was no conversation happening, no business being discussed. He was alone, and the room felt empty in a way it hadn't before. She walked in slowly, her steps careful, unsure of how to approach him. She had been so focused on the work, on keeping everything running smoothly, that she had neglected the space between them. She hadn't taken the time to really sit with him, to understand where he was, emotionally, mentally. But now, standing in the room with him, Evelyn felt the weight of all that had been left unsaid. He didn't turn when she entered, and for a moment, she stood there, unsure of whether to speak or just wait. But then, almost as if he had been waiting for her to say something, he looked up. His eyes met hers, and in them, Evelyn saw something she hadn't seen before, a weariness, a sadness, and yet, something else. Something that, for a moment, she couldn't quite place. "Evelyn," he said, his voice softer than usual, almost hesitant. "I didn't hear you come in." "I wasn't trying to make a sound," she replied, her tone light, though she could feel the tension in the air. She took a step closer, not sure how to bridge the distance between them. "I was just finishing up some work. But I thought I'd come check on you. How are you feeling?" He didn't respond immediately. His gaze flickered away, focusing on the distance outside the window before returning to her. His lips parted as though he were about to say,